Last week, a big step was taken to protect your rights, to protect your right of choice as a consumer when it comes to the meats that are a part of your diet. Hey guys, welcome back to the Harvester Health podcast here. And today we're going to look at an action that was taken in the state of Florida that is looking to help protect and make sure where you know your beef and other meats are coming from. So let's jump into this. So last week, May 1st, 2024, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed SB 1084 that prohibits the sale of lab-grown meat in the state of Florida. And this is a big deal because the lab-grown meat industry continues to grow and it continues to gain some traction. It's even being sold in some restaurants now. We'll talk more about that. But there's some winners associated with this. There's some losers. There's some issues that keep coming to the forefront around this conversation that really need to be discussed a bit more. And I'm going to give you some insight on those so you can actually make more of an educated decision. And I'm going to tell you at the end of this some things that you can do to make sure you're getting what you think is the choice of meat for you, or more importantly, where it's coming from. So just again, a quick recap here. That bill was signed into law in the state of Florida, so it prohibits the sale of lab-grown meat in Florida. Now, I'll talk about this as we go forward. It doesn't necessarily prohibit the production or the technology development aspect of this, but it does prohibit the sale, which is ultimately making sure that it's not ending up in restaurants, it's not ending up in grocery stores or local butchers, anywhere of this nature, and that you know that when you buy meat in the state of Florida, that you are indeed getting that from an animal that was out foraging in its natural environment, that went through the traditional harvesting and processing methods, and that is what you thought you were getting, and that's indeed what you are getting. Now, this is really important because there's a couple of things here in regards to choice and your choice as a consumer that come to the forefront. Now, I want to recap just for a second as we talk about this, that Florida government on their website actually states that this was an effort against the World Economic Forum, whose intention is to have us eating lab-grown meat and insects as our primary sources of protein. And this all revolves around a conversation about there's a lot of problems with the way that meat is produced now, and we're going to get into those and try to shed some light on those topics and really clarify this conversation, give a fair view to both sides here. But who are the winners in this conversation, or who are the winners as a result of what has taken place here? And there's two that immediately come to mind for me on this. The first is we think about the farmers and the ranchers, those individuals whose livelihood is based in and around the production of whether it's beef, poultry, pork, lamb. These are all areas where lab-grown meat is being replicated. And so these are different starter proteins, if you will. But when you look at who wins here, the families in the state of Florida that produce those animal-based products, those are who actually I think are big winners here. Those are one of the categories of winners, but they're not the only one. Another big category here is the consumer. That's you. And that means that you know when you look at a product sitting on the shelf in your local grocer, and again, this is all relevant to the state of Florida, but we're going to talk about the rest of the country here in a moment. When you see these products sitting on your shelf, you're not having to ask questions. Was this grown in a lab? Did this come from a live animal that was grown and raised in its natural environment, which is what we're optimally looking for here? And there's some key reasons for that. You actually know what you're getting. So you are not being deceived. You're not being lied to. You're not being persuaded by some fancy marketing associated with this. It is indeed what you think you are getting. So I think that's a big win. One of the other wins here is that this is keeping real food production alive. And real food production is it's key. It may seem obvious, but it's really key to this conversation because real food production plays into what the outcome, what the quality of the end product is. When we think about true animal husbandry, and I'll stick to cattle here for a moment, being raised on their natural forage, grazing on pasture, the different forbs, legumes, and grasses that they have access to. When they're consuming those, they're creating a different quality of end product there, a higher quality of end product. And that production system is very fruitful to the land if that system is operated correctly in a regenerative mindset, in a regenerative manner. So that's all these efforts to make sure that we don't see lab-grown meat, that is ensuring that traditional production systems, that they stay alive. And what's important for the consumer here is that this maintains a connection of the consumer with their food. We see that there's a lot of disconnect from food, right? You drive through a drive-through and you buy fast food, or you just immediately blitz into the grocery store, grab some, and you exit the way out. But you don't have that connection, and that all of that would only be worse when it comes to lab-grown meat. So if you know where your meat is coming from, you have a trail of transparency. If you have, for example, even with vegetables, if you know who's raising your vegetables, or you're raising vegetables in your own backyard, or on your patio, these are all going to connect you more in depth to your food, and you're going to gain more benefit from that food. I think we can all, if you've raised your own food, like I'll just take a tomato as an example. If you've raised your own tomatoes versus buying store-bought tomatoes, your tomato always tastes better. And it's just inherent that there is something about that. Or if your neighbor gave you a tomato, it was locally sourced. There's something about it, and may be completely psychological, but there's a benefit there as well. If that is all it is, that again is a benefit, that there is some inherent something about that is different, that is better. And so that local connection to food does make a difference. Now, that's who wins on this. And now we're going to talk about not necessarily who loses here, but who is against this bill that has been passed, that's been signed now, and that's in place in the state of Florida. And the individuals that are really against this want this to appear as though it is a political issue. This is not black and white political issue, or red and blue, as you might better state it when it comes to politics. That's not what this is. Now, admittedly, many of the areas where we see opposition to this are what would be often considered red or Republican areas, and areas where we see that there is a pro stance for lab-grown meat, or often more liberal Democratic type areas. But that may just simply have to do with what is more of the industry base in these areas, areas that are maybe that have larger cattle or larger agriculture populations, may be a driving factor behind that. So I don't think to look at this from a political mindset makes total sense here. Yes, it does have some persuasions in that, but I think if you only look at it from that perspective, there's likely, from the lab-grown meat side, there's likely individuals on both sides that are behind promoting that. So if you're against it, I really wouldn't get into the politics of this. Now, that being said, I do want to share a post that was put up pretty quickly after, on the same day, as a matter of fact, after Governor DeSantis signed this. And I'll pop that up here for you. And this is from the company Good Eat. And interesting, you'll note here that they say, we're not going anywhere, as if they're being directly attacked on this. But I think what's more important here is to note that, to what they say, which is, today we're disappointed that Governor Ron DeSantis has signed into law the criminalization of cultivated meat in Florida, in a state that purportedly prides itself on being a land of freedom and individual liberty. Let's stop there for a moment. And what I find a bit interesting here is that we're saying that you aren't given liberty, you aren't given your rights, your choices, if you will. However, what we also see is that we're not being disclosed to what is lab-grown meat. So the idea is that lab-grown meat is going to be introduced, and it may not be labeled as lab-grown meat. So these are all things that haven't been worked out. So if there was complete transparency in this, if there was transparency in how this was, all the steps of how this was being produced, then I can make a more informed decision. But when you don't give me all the information, then you can't make an argument on the other side that this is an infringement of liberty and values. They go on to say that its government is now telling consumers what meat they can or cannot purchase. This law is a setback for everyone, Floridians who deserve the right to eat whatever safe and approved meat they want, Florida's technology sector, innovators and entrepreneurs, all those working to stop the worst impacts of climate change. So again, the argument is being redirected here in that this is more than just an act to stop lab-grown meat, that we're doing something at a societal level that is, or we're seeing something that at a societal level is detrimental, meaning that we're promoting the environmental impact. I'm going to speak much more to that here. And we're also infringing or suppressing the growth of other sectors of industry. And all of these things are just hyperbolic statements. At the end of the day, they don't really add up. And what is funny to me is that it's a discussion, or it's a statement to say that you're infringing on these other sectors, but then you don't acknowledge that if lab-grown meat continues to go forward, that you're also going to see the detriment of agriculture sectors. So you'll see small farms continue to decline. You'll see that industry will continue to gain more share in the agricultural landscape, and you just won't have the same productivity out of the agriculture sector that you previously had. Food production moves away from agriculture and becomes a biotechnology component. And so those things, I think you've got to pull that. You got to look at both sides here, and I just don't think in the response that we saw from Good Meat that was accurately being done. The other thing that I think is a bit appalling when we start talking about these lab-grown meats is that there's this assumption of safety. And listen, I'll acknowledge that the FDA and the USDA have both signed off on these things, but I think as we've seen in the past, that really doesn't mean much of anything when it comes to safety. A lot of things slip through that end up having recalls later, and this may be in the same pipeline. We don't know, right? There's just a lot of unknowns here, and I think until we can have a clear track record of safety associated with these things, that we can't buy into what these producers of these lab-grown meats say and actually get behind them and trust that this is a truly safe product. That is even more, there's even more emphasis there when you start to look at some of the terms that are being applied to this. And I have a list of terms that I want to share with you that are being used as synonymous terms to lab-grown meat, because I think they're very manipulative, deceptive terms. And in fact, when you look at the overall umbrella term that all of these other ones I'm going to share with you falls under, it's now known as cellular agriculture. Cellular agriculture. What is that? Right? That is to say that this entire process is a division of agriculture. That's a complete misrepresentation of agriculture, period. Let's be honest and call it what it is. It's not agriculture, it's biotechnology. That's what it is. And so some of these terms that fall under this cellular agriculture are going to be things like, and these are all synonymous with lab-grown meat, clean meat, in vitro meat, cell cultured, cell cultivated, and victimless meat. These are all synonymous. There's two of these that I really want to focus on. Actually, three of these that I'm going to focus on. So the first is clean meat. When we say clean meat, or label these lab-grown meats as clean meats, then the assumption automatically is that the opposite of that, or what is the alternative, which is your conventionally, naturally produced meat, that it is somehow dirty meat. That doesn't make any sense. So there's nothing dirty about these meats. These naturally produced meats are very nourishing to human health. There's a track record of human history that validates that. So to suggest that it's a clean meat and that the opposition is somehow dirty meat without really directly saying that, That's misleading and deceptive. Victimless meat. The first misrepresentation here is that these animals are victims. And let me just stick with cattle for a moment. These animals aren't victims. These animals have very much, and I'm going to speak to what we do here at Harvest Hills Ranch, and in the general concept of regenerative agriculture, these animals have a very good life. They have a very low stress life. Really the only stress that they feel is just environmental stress from the changes of the weather, just things that no one is ever going to do anything about. Other than that, the way that these animals are handled, the way that these animals are interacted with is very low stress. Even when it comes to having to work them through the corrals, it's a low stress situation. You don't see mama cows acting crazy and doing things that, all over the place, showing signs of high stress. Those things just don't accurately represent, when you say a victimless animal or a victimless meat, again, my animals aren't victims. The only bad day my animals have, if you even want to think about it like this, is the last day that they live when they go to the processor. Prior to that, these animals have actually had purpose in their life. Their purpose is not just as meat production. Their purpose is to move across these pastures consistently, day in and day out, and to graze them, interact with the environment, to drop down manure so that they can continue to nourish the land, that the dung beetles can come in, and those dung beetles can pull that dung down into the ground, and they can use that to feed the plants. The plants become more active, and as a result of that, we see that the microbial growth in the ground becomes more active. There's more nutrients pulled back into the plant, and that goes into the animal. It's this beautiful cyclic symbiotic process that when you call these animals victims and you say that, you basically minimize the value of their life and the time that they spend on farms and ranches, and that's a disservice to these animals and the value that these animals have. And then this last one I want to look at is, this last term is cultivated meat. And this one caught my attention initially when I read it, because when I think of cultivation, I think about the agricultural process of being out with the land. If I'm working with plants, I'm cultivating the plants, nourishing their growth, harvesting from them. You think about cultivating the animals or cultivating the pastures, not necessarily tilling these up or anything, but just in terms of working with those, trying to maximize their productivity and growth. And I feel like this term of cultivated got pulled in with that same mindset. But the point here is that these are all deceptive. These are not accurately portraying what is truly taking place in the production of these products. And I thought this was interesting because this is not solely my opinion associated with this. This has actually come out in the published medical literature as well. And you'll notice here, this is a study that came out talking about the myths of cultured meat, and it goes through a review, and it highlights some of the issues that are associated with the cultured meat on both sides. It does give a fair comparison here, but this is not all that everything associated with lab-grown meat is a positive. That's the way it's portrayed, but that's not the reality of how it is. And so I thought what I would do in terms of sharing this with you is give you perspective initially on how these meats are actually produced, and just give you a schematic, some imagery here of what it actually looks like. And you have to start off with the live animals still, and that's where you're sourcing the cells from. And then once you've got those cells, you take those cells and you put them in a primary culture, and you start to replicate those cells. That's generally in the industry termed expansion. And once you have this biomass of cells, then you start to look at what type of product are you trying to make? Are you trying to make a steak? Are you trying to make ground burger? Are you trying to make sausage where you've got different consistencies in these meats. So these are termed as unstructured meat, semi-structured meat, and structured meat. And then that's just based on what you're trying to create as your end product there. Now, I want to back to that article that talked about some of the myths of these lab-grown meats. I want to talk about what are some of the real concerns here, because I think this is where, when you go back to the very start of our conversation today and you look at the reason that this bill was signed into place, the intention behind why this bill was signed into place, it comes down to what some of these legitimate concerns are right now. And so I've got a couple that I'll share with you here. And the first is that when you look at this replication process, it's a very rapid replication process. The other area where we see rapid replication that everyone knows about is cancer cells. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is the same exact process as cancer cells, but and that it's going to cause cancer. So do not take these statements and run with that and suggest that that's what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying, however, is that rapid replication of cells increases the dysregulation of these cells. It increases the potential for development of an aberrant or damaged cell in some way. A cell that, if it were naturally growing in the animal, would likely undergo recognition by the immune system and undergo apoptosis and be eliminated out, and it wouldn't end up as a component to the meat. And that doesn't have the potential to take place here, because now you've taken away any conversation of an immune system playing a role at maintaining the integrity of the cells that ultimately become the meat that you eat and ultimately become you. So there is a real concern associated with that. And just to give some real world evidence of maybe where some of this arises from, because this isn't just being pulled out of left field, you go back to the very first example we ever have of Dolly the sheep. Many people have heard about Dolly the sheep. This was a sheep that was cloned in, that year was 1997, and she lived to 2003. So that's about a 6-year lifespan, 7-year lifespan, somewhere in there. But what's interesting about that fact is that the lifespan, the typical lifespan for that species of sheep, for that breed of sheep, is generally 11 to 12 years. So she was well short of that. And there we often see with some of these clones in the animal world, this often happens with bulls. You see that sometimes they develop diseases that just aren't natural diseases of these animals, of these species, and they're very difficult to explain sometimes. And you often have to wonder, is that a byproduct of this rapid replication that we see? So that's the first issue that comes to mind. The second is a nutritional conversation. And let me start with the animal that's being raised in its natural environment. That animal that's being raised in its natural environment is out foraging on different grasses, legumes, forbs. Like in our herd, they have access to sea salt. They have access to different minerals, things that they need. And they take all that up, they incorporate it into the meat, all the different plants that they're eating. Those become what would be generally, as an umbrella term here, considered secondary metabolites. They have numerous secondary metabolites that have antioxidant and medicinal types of activities. And those have benefits directly to the animal, but those also have benefits directly to us as humans. And many people will recognize that one of the early nutritional conversations that come to light with the grass-fed meats, grass-finished meats, is the fatty acid profiles. Well, my question becomes, how do you ensure with these lab-grown meats, because you're starting with the cell and not starting with the animal, and that animal hasn't had the opportunity, or those cells haven't had any infusion of the nutrients by virtue of the diet, because there is no diet here. How do you know, or how do you maintain the nutritional status in these lab-grown meats? And the answer is you can't. And this is the reason you can't. So some are going to argue here, well, you can supplement these nutrients back in. You could infuse those nutrients supplementally back into the meats and just ensure that they're there. That may be true. You may be able to do that with B vitamins, with minerals, some antioxidants. But how are you going to do that with all polyphenols? How are you going to do that with the full diversity of compounds that show up in these regeneratively raised meats? The short answer is you're not going to do that. And keep in mind, guys, that there's an expense on the back side of all of this, and the more things you try to put back into that meat, the more the cost factor goes up on that. And the truth of the matter is that corners will ultimately get cut. I mean, let's just call a spade here, right? Corners will get cut on this. And at the end of the day, you can't mimic nature when it comes to this type of conversation. Nature will always do this better than anything man can do, regardless of how much technology you infuse into it. And that's just the way it is, right? Here's the other thing that's really important here. Go back to the diagram that I shared with you where we look at the process here. Remember, you have to start with a donor animal. You still have to start with a live animal here. And when you look at these animals, if you think about how this may actually play out, there has to be a centralization to that donor animal. What that means is that we want to have a decentralized food system, not a centralized food system. So theoretically, we could see that the national cattle inventory and the national inventory of all species that are subject to this lab-grown process could continue to shrink into the hands of fewer and fewer people that have ultimate control over this. Centralization. We don't want that. We want decentralization. We want to have multiple people having control. Everyone individually has their own control. So if I raise my own herd, I have control over the meat that ends up on my table. If you know your farmer, your rancher, who you're buying your meat from, you have control of what ends up on your table. If someone is controlling a very small herd that only is being used to donate cells, then if they decide that they don't want to continue that donation of cells, or they want to stop the production of lab-grown meat, they can do that. They have that capacity. And some of you will think this is very Orwellian, this is very far-fetched. I would ask you to look back not very many years ago to during the pandemic, where we saw that many of the problems in the food production models, where many of you thought, oh, we won't have problems with food, we'll always have availability of food, and you walk into the grocery store and it's not there all of a sudden. And that, especially when it comes to the beef conversation that happened during that time, that was a result of centralization to the beef processing down to 4 main beef processors in the United States. If we would have had decentralization where there would have been numerous meat processors, numerous beef processors all throughout the country, numerous in every region of every state, you would have never seen that conversation come to light. But that's not what happened. So this centralization that becomes a possibility with this model of meat production is a very real consideration. Now, many will hang their hat on this notion that you have to go this direction for 2 reasons. We can't feed the population, and there are big environmental challenges that we are faced with if we continue to move with the current animal production model, the current animal husbandry model. So let's talk about these things, and there's a couple. I'm going to start with the environmental impact here, these environmental issues. And so the first is that there's going to be a rise in greenhouse emissions. I always laugh every time I read this because it very clearly illustrates to me that many of the individuals that are writing these from behind a desk. They're not writing these having spent any time walking across the pasture and directly interacting with these animals, especially on a daily basis as we do here at the ranch. And so when I walk through my herd, these individuals would have you think that all I hear are these animals passing gas, that there is nothing but a continual stream of methane that is leaving their bodies, entering the atmosphere. And this is what I'm going to share with you. Nothing could be more from the truth on that. These animals, I don't know in all the years that I've raised these cattle that I've ever heard one of these animals pass gas. Do they? Of course they do. But do I hear it? Is it so frequent that that's what I hear? No, it is absolutely not. And that probably has a lot to do also with the fact that they're eating their natural forage around here. Their rumens are happy and they're producing the right type of gases as a byproduct and not producing them in excess. So they have a balanced rumen, balanced digestion is really the main takeaway from this. But here's what I think is interesting about this. There's 2 points that I never seem to hear accurately discussed or even adequately discussed on this. And the first is photosynthesis. So let's all go back to our high school biology class, and we remember seeing photosynthesis. The plant takes in carbon dioxide and releases oxygen. So if you think about that for a moment, if we want to capture this carbon dioxide that is being released or that ultimately ends up in the atmosphere from the methane release, then that carbon dioxide is actually a fertilizer to the plants. So the more fertilizer, if you will, that the plant takes in, the more of this carbon dioxide, a couple of things happen here. You're beginning to be able to nourish the growth of that plant, and that means that that herd of cattle are going to come through and they're going to eat that grass again. So now you're seeing the cycle. They release the carbon dioxide, the plant captures the carbon dioxide, they release the methane, converts to carbon dioxide, the plant captures the carbon dioxide, converts that into oxygen and into a carbon for plant growth, and the animal harvests that. That is just a big carbon cycle is all that is. It is not a steady, unending release of carbon simply into the atmosphere. Okay? So let's be honest about where all this carbon is going, first of all. The second thing that I never hear discussed about this is that when you look back 200, 250 years ago, and you look at the landscape of the United States, you had herds of buffalo, massive herds of buffalo, you had herds of elk, herds of other ruminant animals, deer, and when you look at the total number of species at that time compared to now, there were far greater numbers of animals then than there are now. And the point here is that that means you would have had a much greater release of methane and potentially the increased greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, but yet no one talks about that. So let's be honest, if it wasn't happening back then and it wasn't a detriment back then, why all of a sudden is it a detriment now with actually fewer number of animals now than what we had back then? It's not. So let's have an honest conversation about this. The next thing that you'll hear when it comes to these environmental issues is that cattle use up too much land. And it's not just cattle, right? But that's the one they like to pick on with this. They use up too much land. And we could be using this land for other things. So two things immediately come to mind for me on this. One is you can graze cattle in areas that really are not good for much of anything else. So right off the bat, that means that we're actually putting unproductive land into a productive model. The other way that we can more efficiently use land is by stacking systems. So here at my ranch, we actually integrate the cattle in with the poultry. So they're moving with the ducks, with the chickens, with the turkeys, and all of these guys are integrating in with each other. They're using and rotating on the same pastures throughout the year. And so we actually get more productivity out of the same amount of space. Actually quite a bit more productivity because now both species or multiple species are all benefiting from each other. So instead of pointing at the animal, point at the system, and let's actually rebuild and modify these systems to be more productive versus just accepting that a status quo system is inherently the problem and the cause of these environmental impact issues. Not true. And also this idea that we've got to limit the land that is used for cattle production is coming from a viewpoint of scarcity. We've got to harbor and tighten up all our resources. We got to be scarce about everything, and it doesn't come from this idea of abundance, and that's just not a way to live any aspect of your life. You should always be coming from the viewpoint of abundance. There's always more that can be done. There's always more that can be produced. There's always more that these animals, more ways that they can thrive. That's how we should be thinking, and that's not what the proponents of lab-grown meat are telling you. They're telling you, and literally as I sit here and think about this, scarcity, scare, so even the terminology is, they want you to think that you have to go this direction of lab-grown meat because you're not going to have any resources if you don't have lab-grown meat. I'll stop at that. Now, the next thing that comes up here is that harvesting animals is unethical. I touched on this a bit earlier, but just let me quickly recap on this. These systems for animal management matter here, and that's a huge part of this conversation that typically just gets pushed right over and we just move on to the next talking point in this conversation. Not here. We're going to address these talking points. The system of production of animal husbandry matters. These animals are not raised in unethical manners. I would actually argue that if you're only using these animals as a supply of cells to grow lab-grown meat, that is unethical because you're not allowing these animals to flourish in their natural environment. You're not allowing these animals to, as a species and as a herd, to develop over time, to allow their genetics to flourish and to adapt to the environment that they're functioning in. All of those things, to me, that's unethical. That's unmoral. I want these animals to become the best version of them that they can be, to live out the most quality days that they can live out on my ranch, with me helping to create the environment that is most optimal for them. And at the end of the day, they have only one bad moment, and it happens so quickly that they don't even know it happens. And that's when they're harvested, and they're harvested in a very ethical manner. There's nothing, many people like to often push around these videos about how unethical these animals are treated and all this. In the facilities that I've been a part of, where we operate with small farm facilities or small facilities for processing our poultry and our cattle, and these are all USDA inspected facilities, these animals aren't handled this way. That is absolutely unacceptable, and we can put our eyes on these animals to validate that, and we do. So this idea of it's unethical, this is an environmental issue, it just doesn't add weight. It just doesn't hold weight, guys, right? So these animals have a purpose, right? And I talked about that a little bit earlier. Here's something else that I think is important to bring forth. And it's that for those of you that look at your meat from a religious perspective, kosher, halal, when you think about this as it relates to lab-grown meat, my question to you is, how are you going to acknowledge that your meat is compliant for kosher or compliant for any other set of laws that you have for your meat? It wasn't even harvested in a particular way, so how can we even begin to think that it's going to be compliant? Do those rules even Are those even consideration? Do those rules even apply? See, these are all things that we have to think about, because those are questions that through my professional obligations, I'm often asked about. Is this kosher? Is this halal? How do you guys process this? What does that look like? And I can honestly answer those. If it's not kosher, it's not. If it's not halal, it's not. That's fine, right? It's just not. But I can at least be black and white about it. I can say yes or no. When it comes to lab-grown meat, who knows? We don't know. We don't have an answer to that. Now, this other thing, the other part of this that I said I wanted to touch on, which is an issue that's often brought up, is that we can't feed the world if we don't go the direction of lab-grown meat. Nonsense. And the reason that's nonsense, one, goes back to the stacking of systems. We can be far more productive with the land than what we typically see. But also, when you look at how land is being utilized in terms of what's being produced on that land, and you actually ask, what is being done with the product that's being produced on that land? And could we as a society yield more value if we were raising animals, quality animals were being raised on that land and feeding the populace? Would that make more sense? And in many cases it would. And so the other thing you got to think about here is that we have a conversation around nutrition that focuses on calories and doesn't focus on nutrient density. And that is the wrong endpoint. If anything, look at the current epidemic, the health epidemic, the obesity epidemic, and all the comorbidities that are associated with that. If anything has shown us that focusing on calories is the wrong endpoint, that is definitely the evidence to say that we're on the wrong track here. Instead, let's focus on nutrient density. That's really where the conversation needs to come from. That is where, when you start looking at micronutrients, when you start looking at vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, secondary metabolites, that's where all these things begin to matter. Those are drivers of human health. Those change human biochemistry and physiology. Yes, you need some calories in there, but we can get the calories. The calories are not the hard part. The nutrient density is really the focal point here. So when you move into this lab-grown model, I already talked about the problems, that the things that would remain unanswered, and really why you'll never replicate with a lab-grown meat nutritional profiles that you find in naturally produced meat. So if you want the optimal focus to be nutrient density, stay with the naturally produced animal here. Now, let's talk about what the landscape looks like so far, okay? So where is lab-grown meat actually where can you find it at right now? Well, there's two places that it's been served thus far in restaurants. And interestingly, they're on opposite coast here. So Washington, D.C. has been one location where a restaurant is serving this cultivated, aka lab-grown meat, and the other is in San Francisco. And so if you're in those areas, there are restaurants in those areas that are serving that. So just be aware of that. That may be disclosed to you, may not be disclosed to you. I don't live in those areas. I don't go to those areas. So I don't know. But you as a consumer in that area, you need to be aware. Is this only relevant? I need to bring this back up. Is this only relevant to beef? Absolutely not, guys. This is relevant to beef, definitely to chicken, which means at some point you'll see this come into play if this continues to evolve, which on all likelihood it will. You're going to see this happen with turkey, so you're going to need to pay attention there as well. Pork and lamb. Those are all in the process or are currently being used for culturing cells and producing lab-grown meat. Now, I do think I started all of this talking about what a great move that Florida made with Governor Ron DeSantis signing into law this bill. But Florida is not the only state that is looking to move in this direction. Arizona, Alabama, Tennessee, these states are looking to move in this direction as well. There's some other states that are making considerations here also. And I'm going to throw this out. I live in the state of Texas. Texas is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, cattle production states in the country. And so my question is, what are we doing what's the government of Texas doing? Governor Abbott, I know you got a lot on your plate, but we need to take a look at this. This could significantly affect the cattle industry in the state of Texas, which is a big part of our industry and income for this state. I'll throw this in another direction here in the state as well, which is the Agriculture Commissioner, Sid Miller. You know, he could have a hand in this. He's a big proponent of the Go Texan initiative, where there's support for Texas individuals, for businesses, for Texas entrepreneurs, that products and things that are produced in Texas get highlighted and emphasized. And if we want to continue that, if we want the beef industry in the state of Texas to continue to flourish, then hey, let's get behind that. Let's put that Go Texan initiative behind that and put a stance against these lab-grown meats, which are trying to take a sharehold of that industry in the state, which doesn't need to be decimated or affected in any way any more than it already has been in 2024 with all the wildfires and everything else that was going on, especially in the northwestern part of the state. So what can you do? That's really what this comes down to at the end of the day. What can you do? There's a couple of things that you can do. One is you need to know where your meat's coming from. That's the most important thing. And you can do that through developing a relationship with your local farmer, with your local rancher. There's a lot of guys out here like me. You don't need to buy everything from me. Not everybody in the country needs to buy from Harvest Hills Ranch. You need to find people in your local area. Harvest Hills Ranch emphasizes and focuses on supporting the people in Southeast Texas. There are other farmers, other ranchers in your area that you can develop relationships with, and you can support their families and their businesses and know exactly where your meat is coming from. Have a trail of transparency. Ask questions. Don't be hesitant about asking questions. If you go to the grocery store, continue to watch the labels on the grocery store. Continue to be aware of what's going on. But at the end of the day, I'm going to tell you, forget the grocery store. Develop the relationship with your local food producer, or produce it yourself. Those are really the two best options. And I'll stand on those two because at the end of the day, we need to develop the small local food industry, because that's what's going to keep us decentralized and all keep us fed regardless of what happens throughout our country. That's the first thing you can do. The next thing you can do is you can hit that like and hit that subscribe button and come back to this channel and listen to more of these conversations. You don't need to watch this. Just play what I'm saying as you're doing whatever you're doing throughout your day. You're doing things around the house. Maybe you've got this playing in the background, but keep yourself educated. And my goal is to keep you educated so you can make better decisions about your food and the choices and how that's going to ultimately, at the end of the day, impact your health. So if you'll smack that like button or and subscribe button, it'd be greatly appreciated, guys. So I'm going to leave us on that note. Make sure you tune in for the next conversation that we have here. And until next time, guys, take care, and I will see you then.